The relentless sheeting rain, a brutal, unseasonal deluge, had been falling for 3 solid days, turning the normally placid Willow Creek into a raging chocolate-brown torrent that chewed at its banks with furious hunger. Now, in the pre-dawn blackness of a Tuesday morning, as the wind howled a mournful dirge, the creek had finally breached its confines, sending a devastating flood surge into the low-lying neighborhoods of Haven County. At the Emergency Operations Center, a concrete bunker humming with the controlled chaos of impending disaster, Elena Ramirez. Haven County's Director of Disaster Response and Emergency Management hadn't slept in nearly 48 hours. Her face illuminated by the eerie flickering glow of a dozen computer monitors displaying ominously red weather radar, rapidly shifting inundation maps, and rapidly escalating lists of distress calls was a mask of strained, almost painful focus. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee adrenaline and the faint metallic tang of fear. All units, repeat all units. Elena's voice, amplified by the EOC's comms system, cut through the cacophony of ringing phones and urgent radio chatter, each word precise, despite the exhaustion threatening to fray her edges. We have visual confirmation from Air 1 the Miller's Bend levee has been critically compromised. I repeat, Miller's Bend levee is gone. We are looking at catastrophic, unsurvivable flash flooding for the entire Sycamore Valley residential district within the next 30 to 60 minutes, possibly less. This is now a mandatory immediate evacuation order for all zones C, D, and E. Prioritize swift water rescue teams to the known low points and vulnerable care facilities. Get those reverse 911 calls out now and get me the damn mayor on the line. Valfin. Her team, a well-oiled machine composed of seasoned emergency managers, grim-faced sheriff's deputies, stoic fire chiefs, and pale public works officials, scrambled to implement the new dire directive. Sycamore Valley, a sprawling collection of older homes and newer subdivisions, was home to nearly 5,000 residents, many of them elderly, infirm, or with limited mobility. This was their absolute worst-case scenario, the one they drilled for, but prayed would never materialize. As Elena coordinated air support for potential rooftop rescues and desperately rerouted emergency vehicles around already impassable debris-choked roads, a specific call patch caught her ear, a field unit reporting from Zone D, an area already experiencing rapidly rising churning waters. Sheriff Diaz, this is Unit 7. We're at the Carter Residence, 112 Willow Creek Lane. House is taking on water fast. Looks like a total loss imminent. We're attempting to evacuate Master Sergeant Ben Carter, elderly male, confirmed disabled, uses a wheelchair. He states he was in his basement workshop when the water first started coming in, trying to move some irreplaceable mementos to higher ground. The basement door, the exterior cellar access. Sergeant, it's jammed or locked from the outside. He can't get it open. Water's already ankle deep down there by his account and rising fast. He's trapped. Elena's blood ran cold, a sudden visceral chill that had nothing to do with the drafty EOC. Ben Carter, Master Sergeant Benjamin Carter, U.S. Army retired, a decorated combat veteran, a double amputee from an IED in Afghanistan, a man whose quiet dignity and fierce, almost stubborn independence she deeply admired. He lived alone, his small, unassuming bungalow, backing onto a tributary of Willow Creek. She knew that house. She knew that basement. He'd proudly shown her his intricate woodworking shop there last Veterans Day during a community outreach event. It had a reinforced steel door leading to an external concrete staircase, his primary access point for moving larger pieces of wood and equipment. Jammed or locked from the outside, in the middle of a flash flood. Deputy Cow. Elena's voice was sharp, cutting through the static, her mind already racing through horrifying possibilities. What's the visual status of that door? Can you force it? What's the obstruction? Negative, Director Ramirez. It's a heavy-duty steel door, looks custom, definitely dead-bolted, and something significant seems to be wedged against it from the exterior. We can hear him shouting faintly, but the water's coming up too fast for us to try and break it down without specialized breaching tools, and the access stairwell is already partially submerged, becoming a whirlpool. We need a swift water rescue team with heavy hydraulics here now. And frankly, Director, it looks deliberate. Ben Carter trapped in a flooding basement, the only viable exit deliberately obstructed. A horrifying suspicion, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, began to form in Elena's mind. She remembered with sickening clarity the ongoing, increasingly bitter dispute between Ben Carter and his overbearing, vindictive HOA president, a woman named Karen Miller, who lived directly next door. Miller had been relentlessly harassing Carter for months, a campaign of petty tyranny aimed at forcing him to remove his accessibility ramp, complaining about the unsightly nature of his adaptive equipment, even trying to get the HOA to fine him for the clutter of his woodworking projects, visible from her meticulously manicured floodlit lawn. Miller had made no secret in public HOA meetings and vitriolic emails, copies of which had anonymously found their way to Elena's office via concerned neighbors of her desire to see Ben Carter, the disabled veteran whose very presence seemed to offend her rigid sense of suburban perfection driven from the neighborhood. There had even been an anonymous threatening note left on Ben's door a few weeks prior after a particularly contentious HOA meeting. Some people just don't belong. Floods have a way of cleansing things. At the time, Elena had urged Ben to report it to the sheriff, but he dismissed it as Miller just blowing smoke. Now those words echoed with chilling prescience. Could she be capable of this? Of deliberately trapping a disabled man in a flooding basement, using the chaos of a natural disaster as cover for an act of monstrous, potentially murderous malice? Elena Ramirez County, disaster response chief, felt a cold, controlled fury settle over her, a dangerous calm that her team recognized as a precursor to decisive, often unorthodox action. The flood was a relentless, indiscriminate enemy. But if Karen Miller had played a hand in Ben Carter's current peril, she was about to discover that human justice, delivered by a woman who commanded the county's entire emergency apparatus, could be just as swift and far more targeted. This wasn't just a rescue mission anymore. It was rapidly becoming a crime scene. Elena Ramirez was a woman who thrived in the eye of the storm, both literally and metaphorically. Her career in emergency management had been forged in the aftermath of hurricanes that tore through coastlines, earthquakes that shattered cities, and industrial accidents that spewed toxic clouds. She was known for her unshakable calm under extreme pressure, her decisive, clear-headed leadership, and her fierce, often outspoken advocacy for the most vulnerable members of her community. Her current role as Haven County's Director of Disaster Response was the culmination of 2 decades of dedicated public service, a position that demanded not just logistical brilliance and strategic acumen, but a deep well of empathy and an unwavering commitment to saving lives, often at great personal risk. Her phone buzzed, a text from her direct Superior County manager, Davies. Elena, hearing chatter about you overstepping on a potential criminal matter at Carter's scene. Stick to disaster response. Let SO handle any LE issues. Politics are already messy with this flood. Elena's jaw tightened. Davies was a bureaucrat always worried about optics and jurisdictional squabbles. She typed a curt reply, saving a life. We'll debrief later. Master Sergeant Ben Carter, retired, was a man Elena admired profoundly. He had served his country with quiet distinction, returning from multiple combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq with grievous injuries. The loss of both legs below the knee shrapnel embedded too close to his spine to remove, and lungs scarred by burn pits that had confined him to a wheelchair, but had never broken his resilient spirit. He was a gifted woodworker, his small basement workshop, a sanctuary where he created beautiful, intricate pieces. His hands gnarled from old injuries and encroaching arthritis, still capable of coaxing magic from raw timber. He lived a quiet, fiercely independent life, his small bungalow meticulously adapted to his needs, his dry wit and unwavering resilience, an inspiration to all who knew him. He was also, most unfortunately, the next-door neighbor of Karen Miller. Karen Miller was the self-appointed iron-fisted queen of the Sycamore Valley HOA, a woman whose obsession with property values, aesthetic conformity, and the draconian enforcement of community bylaws bordered on the pathological. She was notorious for her public tirades at HOA meetings, her endless stream of violation notices for the most trivial of infractions, a trash can left out an hour too long, a garden gnome deemed aesthetically discordant, wind chimes labeled noise pollution, and her particular thinly veiled disdain for anyone or anything that didn't fit her narrow, suffocating vision of suburban perfection. Ben Carter, with his government-issued wheelchair, ramp, his occasional need for visiting VA support staff, and his unapologetic quiet veteran's pride, seemed to be a particular festering affront to Karen Miller's sensibilities. The inciting incident that had marked the beginning of Karen Miller's escalating campaign against Ben Carter had occurred nearly a year prior. Ben, with the help of a local veterans support group, VetsBuild, had installed a professionally built ADA code-compliant aluminum wheelchair ramp leading to his front porch. Karen Miller had immediately launched an HOA offensive, demanding the ramp's removal, citing a convoluted interpretation of aesthetic guidelines and claiming it negatively impacted the neighborhood's visual harmony and significantly lowered surrounding property values. She had even at one particularly acrimonious HOA meeting referred to the ramp as an eyesore and insidiously insinuated that Ben should consider moving to a more suitable dedicated facility for individuals with his extensive challenges. Ben, with quiet dignity and the vocal support of several sympathetic neighbors, had fought back, pointing out his legal rights under the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. The HOA board, after a contentious debate and the veiled threat of significant legal action from a pro bono lawyer connected to VetsBuild, had reluctantly backed down, but Karen Miller had never forgiven Ben for what she clearly perceived as a personal defeat and a blatant defiance of her absolute authority. The rising action of her harassment was relentless and petty, yet carried a disturbing, escalating undertone of malice. First, there were the anonymous complaints to city code enforcement about Ben's unmaintained yard. His yard was immaculate, tended by a volunteer from the VetsBuild group, and improper storage of hazardous materials, his neatly stacked woodworking supplies in his own driveway covered by a tarp. Each complaint, though ultimately dismissed after inspections, required Ben to endure stressful bureaucratic hassles and feelings of being constantly under siege. Then came the incident with the drainage ditch. A natural drainage swale ran between Ben's property and Karen Miller's, crucial for preventing localized flooding during heavy rains. Just before the start of the rainy season, Ben noticed that Karen Miller had had her landscapers build up a decorative impacted earth berm along her side of the swale, complete with newly planted dense shrubbery, effectively blocking a significant portion of its natural flow and redirecting potential runoff directly towards Ben's basement workshop entrance. When Ben had politely, if warily, pointed this out, Karen had feigned utter ignorance, then claimed it was a necessary landscaping improvement to prevent erosion on her property, and that any flooding on his side was his problem, likely due to poor property maintenance or improper grading on his part. She'd even suggested his ramp was channeling water towards his house. A second, more chilling incident occurred a few months before the current flood. During a severe thunderstorm that had caused a localized power outage, Ben's backup generator, a VA-provided medical necessity for his CPAP machine and other medical equipment, had kicked in. Karen Miller had immediately called the police, reporting a noise ordinance violation and falsely claiming Ben's generator was dangerously emitting noxious fumes and was improperly positioned too close to her property line. Thus, the responding officers, finding the generator to be well maintained, properly ventilated, and operating well within legal noise limits, had apologized to Ben for the disturbance. But Karen Miller had stood on her porch arms, crossed, glaring her message: clear any aspect of Ben's disability, any accommodation he required, was an intolerable affront to her. The midpoint twist, the revelation that Karen Miller's animosity might be rooted in something far more disturbing than just HOA power-tripping and aesthetic fascism, came to Elena Ramirez through an unexpected, almost forgotten channel. During a county-wide disaster preparedness seminar Elena was leading several months prior, a former resident of Sycamore Valley, a woman who had moved away years ago after a bitter dispute with the HOA, approached her during a break. The woman recognized Karen Miller's name when Elena mentioned interagency cooperation with HOAs for emergency planning. That Karen Miller. The former resident had said, her voice low and troubled, glancing around, as if afraid of being overheard even years later. She's not just a busybody, Director Ramirez. There's something genuinely wrong with her. Years ago, before she became HOA president, there was a small flood in our cul-de-sac. Nothing like this one, mind you, but it damaged several basements, including hers, quite significantly. She became absolutely obsessed, blamed everyone. The county, her neighbors, even a family whose downspout she claimed was misdirected by a single inch. She tried to sue them, hounded them relentlessly with complaints and anonymous accusations until they finally sold their house at a loss and moved. She has this almost pathological fear and resentment of water damage and anyone she perceives as contributing to it, however irrationally. and she holds grudges like you wouldn't believe. There were whispers back then about things she might have done to encourage people she didn't like to leave. The woman had also mentioned that Karen Miller had a substantial insurance policy on her own home, one that paid out significantly more if surrounding properties were devalued or condemned. A chilling thought, a pathological fear of flooding, a history of blaming and hounding neighbors, a potential financial motive linked to property destruction. Suddenly, Karen Miller's actions regarding the drainage swale, her general animosity towards Ben Carter, whose property was on slightly lower ground and adjacent to hers, took on a more sinister, potentially delusional and financially motivated dimension. Was it possible that in her warped mind, Ben Carter, the disabled veteran living next door, had become the symbolic focus of her flood-related anxieties, resentments, and a convenient target for improving her own financial standing via insurance claims? And in the face of a real catastrophic flood, what might such a delusion coupled with greed drive her to do? Ben had mentioned to Elena once, in passing his concern, that Karen was always nosing around his property and that he was thinking of installing a small security camera near his workshop entrance after some tools had gone missing. He'd wondered if it was just kids or something more. Elena had dismissed it at the time, but now a red herring had briefly surfaced when initial reports of Ben's entrapment came through. His basement workshop, as Elena knew, was known to be cluttered with tools, lumber, and works in progress. The first assumption by some on Elena's EOC team was that he had simply gotten trapped by shifting debris carried in by the floodwaters, or perhaps a door that had swollen shut from the rising water. But the deputies on scene were adamant the heavy steel door was dead-bolted from the outside, and something substantial was physically wedged against it. This wasn't an accident of the flood. This was a deliberate, calculated act. Elena Ramirez, coordinating the county's desperate battle against the rapidly rising waters, now faced a horrifying secondary crisis, a potential attempted murder unfolding within the larger disaster, targeting a vulnerable man she knew and respected, perpetrated by a neighbor whose malice seemed to know no bounds even in the face of nature's overwhelming fury. Swift Water Rescue Team Alpha, what's your goddamn ETA to 112 Willow Creek Lane? Elena's voice was tight, dangerously controlled, a stark contrast to the practiced calm she usually projected in the EOC. Every minute, every second counted. The water in Sycamore Valley was rising with terrifying, relentless speed. Director, this is Alpha Lead Martinez, hitting heavy debris fields and multiple submerged vehicles on Sycamore Avenue. Access is severely compromised. Current is like a freight train. Maybe 10 to 15 minutes if we can find a clear path without losing a man or a raft. The current is absolutely brutal out here. 10 to 15 minutes. Ben Carter might not have that long. Understood, Alpha Lead. Get there as fast as humanly possible. Victim is disabled wheelchair user trapped in a basement with rapidly rising water. Exterior cellar door is reportedly dead-bolted and heavily barricaded from the outside. She repeated that last detail with cold emphasis, wanting every first responder within earshot to understand the grave implications. This wasn't just a flood victim. This was a potential active crime victim. She turned to her logistics chief, a harried man named Henderson, no relation to Karen. I need aerial reconnaissance eyes directly over 112 Willow Creek. Is the Coast Guard Jayhawk still in our sector? Yes, Director. Diverting them now for a visual assessment and potential hoist capability. But with this cloud cover and thick smoke from the foothill fires being pushed down by the storm system, visibility is going to be near zero at street level. They might not see anything useful. Elena slammed her fist on the console, a rare display of outward frustration. It warred with the cold dread gripping her heart. She knew Ben Carter's bungalow. It was an older house, the basement notoriously prone to seepage, even in normal heavy rains. In a flash, flood of this magnitude, her direct line to the sheriff's dispatch crackled. Director Ramirez, this is Sergeant Peterson on scene commander at Willow Creek Lane. We've managed to get a tactical team member with a waterproof camera scope through a small, partially broken basement window. Water is chest high on Master Sergeant Carter. He's clinging to a support beam, barely keeping his head above water. He's conscious but fading hypothermic. That door. Director, it's not just deadbolted. Someone deliberately jammed a heavy iron pry bar, looks like a demolition tool, through the external hasp, and then piled at least a dozen heavy new-looking sandbags against it. He was sealed in. Completely. Sealed in. The words hung in the air of the EOC, chilling everyone to the bone. This was premeditated. This was monstrous. Karen Miller. It had to be. Sergeant Peterson. Elena's voice was dangerously quiet, almost a whisper. Is Karen Miller, the next-door neighbor at 110 Willow Creek, on scene? Has anyone accounted for her negative director? Her house appears to be buttoned up tight, sandbagged higher and more professionally than anyone else's on the block. Looks like a fortress. No sign of her. We tried to raise her on the bullhorn for evacuation multiple times, no response. She wouldn't evacuate, Elena thought grimly. Not if she thought her problem was about to be permanently solved by the floodwaters. Or worse, she was still nearby watching, deriving some perverse satisfaction. Or another chilling thought, she had an accomplice. Those sandbags looked professionally placed, not the work of one panicked woman. The HOA maintained a small storage shed with emergency supplies, including sandbags. Who had access? The HOA maintenance supervisor, a man named Doug Snyder, known to be fiercely loyal to Karen Miller. Alpha lead. Elena barked into the radio. Forget the current access route to Carter's house if it's blocked. Is there any way to approach from the rear from Miller's property? It should be on slightly higher ground. Director Miller's property is a fortress, like Peterson said. Sandbags stacked 6 high, and it looks like she's erected some kind of temporary plywood flood barriers. Access from that side would be extremely difficult, and definitely through her yard. We might encounter resistance. Then make it difficult and prepare for resistance. Elena ordered, her voice hard as flint. I want that rescue team at Carter's basement access now. And Sergeant Peterson, I want a unit to breach Karen Miller's property if necessary. Find her, detain her for questioning regarding obstruction of emergency operations and potential involvement in the endangerment of Master Sergeant Carter. Consider her hostile. And Peterson, see if you can locate a Doug Snyder HOA maintenance. He may be with her or involved. She knew she was pushing the boundaries of her authority, blurring the lines between disaster response and criminal investigation, but Ben Carter's life was on the line. And if Karen Miller and potentially an accomplice were responsible, they would not escape justice, not even amidst the chaos of Haven County's worst natural disaster in a century. Elena grabbed her own emergency go-bag, a heavy-duty waterproof radio, and her service weapon, checking the clip by instinct. I'm heading to the scene, she announced to her stunned deputy director. You have command of the EOC. Keep those evacuation routes clear, and pray we're not too late for Ben. The journey to Sycamore Valley was a surreal nightmare obstacle course of flooded streets where road signs were submerged, abandoned cars bobbing like macabre toys, and desperate fleeing residents slogging through waist-deep water. Elena, driving her own county-issued high-clearance SUV equipped with emergency lights and sirens, navigated the treacherous conditions with a grim, white-knuckled determination, her mind racing, planning, praying. She arrived at Willow Creek Lane to a scene of organized, desperate chaos. The swift water rescue team, Alpha, had indeed managed to breach Karen Miller's sandbag defenses using bolt cutters on a section of chain-link fence, and were now working frantically at Ben Carter's cellar door, the muddy, debris-filled water swirling around their waists. The deafening roar of a portable generator powering a heavy-duty hydraulic spreader, a jaws of life, filled the air, battling the roar of the flood. One of Karen Miller's expensive patio umbrellas had been uprooted and was now snagged against the cellar door, further hampering access. Elena waded through the knee-deep, frigid, murky water, her eyes fixed on the cellar door. She could see the pry bar still wedged tight the pile of sodden, professionally stacked sandbags. This was no accident. This was a deliberate, calculated act of malice. Status, she yelled to Alpha Lead Martinez, a young, powerful firefighter whose face was etched with strain. Almost through, Director, Martinez shouted back over the roar of the hydraulics in the storm. Doors buckled, but the deadbolt's a bastard, and that pry bar is deep. Another minute, maybe less. A section of the rescue team was trying to dislodge what looked like Karen Miller's heavy cast-iron chimenea, which had, accidentally, toppled against the door, further blocking it. Then a cry from inside the basement, weak gurgling, but audible even over the din. Help. Water. Can't breathe. Ben Carter. He was still alive. Barely. The steel door finally groaned, buckled and ripped open with a screech of tortured metal. Two rescuers, tethered by safety lines, disappeared into the black, churning water of the basement. An agonizing minute passed each second an eternity. Then they emerged, supporting a barely conscious Ben Carter between them, his face gray and waxen, his body limp, his lips tinged with blue. Martinez, a look of fury on his face, ripped the sodden patio umbrella away and flung it aside. They carried him to higher ground, towards Karen Miller's now violated patio, where paramedics, waiting with a backboard and emergency medical kit, immediately began working on him, shielding him from the relentless rain with a tarp. Hypothermia, near drowning, possible injuries from being battered by debris in the surging water. He was alive, but only just. As they loaded Ben into the waiting ambulance, its lights flashing eerily in the storm-darkened morning, Elena caught sight of movement at an upstairs window of Karen Miller's house next door. A curtain twitched. A face pale and indistinct peered out for a fleeting second, then vanished. Karen Miller was home, watching. Elena's radio crackled. "Director Ramirez, this is Sergeant Peterson. We have located Karen Miller and a male subject identified as Douglas Snyder, HOA Maintenance Supervisor. They were attempting to leave her residence via the back alley, carrying 2 suitcases and what appears to be a lockbox. Miller claims she was unaware of the severity of the flood or the evacuation order for Master Sergeant Carter. Snyder is claiming he was just helping a neighbor secure her property. They are both being extremely uncooperative and demanding lawyers. Bring them to the mobile command post, Sergeant." Elena ordered, her voice like ice. "Separately. I want to have a word with Ms. Miller and Mr. Snyder myself and secure her residence. It's now a crime scene. Check for any recently accessed insurance documents or correspondence." The confrontation took place in the cramped, rain-lashed confines of the county's mobile command unit, set up on a slightly elevated section of road. Karen Miller, wrapped in an expensive raincoat that did little to conceal her shivering, her blonde hair plastered to her head, sat opposite Elena, her expression one of indignant theatrical outrage. Snyder was being held in a separate vehicle. "This is an absolute travesty, Director Ramirez," Karen began, her voice shrill, attempting to seize control. "I am a victim of this flood, just like everyone else. And now I'm being harassed by your officers, accused of ludicrous, slanderous things. That man Carter, he probably got himself trapped. He's always been careless, irresponsible with his property, a liability to this entire neighborhood." "Ms. Miller." Elena interrupted, her voice dangerously quiet, her eyes boring into Karen's. "Master Sergeant Carter, a disabled combat veteran, was found locked in his flooding basement. The steel cellar door was deadbolted from the outside, a heavy demolition pry bar was wedged through the hasp, and a dozen new sandbags identical to those in the HOA emergency shed Mr. Snyder has access to were piled against it. He was deliberately sealed in to drown. We found tools in your garden shed matching the pry bar. We have a witness who saw you and Mr. Snyder near his cellar entrance shortly before the floodwaters hit that area, and you were both attempting to flee your home with valuables despite claiming to be unaware of the severity of the situation. Furthermore, Ms. Miller, we found a recently updated, very substantial insurance policy on your home with a rider that specifically increases payout if adjacent properties suffer catastrophic damage leading to condemnation." Karen Miller's face went white. Her eyes darted around the small space, seeking an escape, a denial. That's circumstantial. You can't prove anything. He's a nuisance. He diverts floodwater onto my property with his illegal ramp and his messy yard. I was just protecting my home. My investment. Protecting your home by attempting to murder your disabled neighbor for an insurance payout. Elena's voice was scathing. By leaving him to die a horrific death alone in the dark as the waters rose, while your accomplice helped you stack the sandbags. Karen began to tremble, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. "He deserved it," she whispered, her voice, a venomous hiss, a flicker of her true sociopathic nature exposed. "He's a drain on this community, a blight, the flood. It was an opportunity to solve a problem, permanently. And Snyder owes me. He just did what he was told." Her confession, cold-blooded and utterly devoid of remorse, hung in the air, more chilling than the storm raging outside. Just then, Sergeant Peterson entered the command unit, holding a small mud-caked object in an evidence bag. "Director, we found this wedged under a loose floorboard in Carter's workshop just above the waterline. Looks like a mini security camera. The SD card is still intact." He looked at Karen Miller, whose eyes widened in fresh horror. Ben had installed that camera. Karen Miller Douglas Snyder. Elena said, her voice resonating with the full weight of her office and the outrage of a community betrayed. "You are both under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, aggravated assault, false imprisonment, and reckless endangerment during a declared state of emergency. You have the right to remain silent." As her deputies led a now sobbing, incoherent Karen Miller and a stoic, defeated Doug Snyder away, Elena turned back to the grim task of managing the ongoing disaster. Her heart was heavy with the knowledge of the darkness that lurked beneath the placid surface of her county, a darkness that even the most devastating forces of nature could not entirely eclipse. But it was a darkness that, just as she vowed with the aid of a tiny, mud-caked piece of technology, would ultimately, irrefutably overcome. The aftermath of the Great Haven County flood was a period of immense challenge and slow, painful recovery. Master Sergeant Ben Carter, after weeks in critical condition, battling pneumonia, hypothermia, and infections, miraculously began to heal, though the psychological scars of being trapped, knowing his neighbor intended him to die, ran deep. He began attending a PTSD support group for veterans. The outpouring of support from his fellow veterans, his neighbors, most of whom were horrified by Karen Miller's actions and Snyder's complicity, and the wider community, was a testament to respect and affection. His beloved woodworking tools were lost, but volunteers organized by VetsBuild pledged to rebuild his workshop better, more accessible, and with a state-of-the-art security system. The legal proceedings against Karen Miller and Doug Snyder were swift. The video from Ben's camera was damning, showing Miller directing Snyder as they barricaded the door. Snyder, facing overwhelming evidence, accepted a plea deal in exchange for testifying against Miller. Her defense of diminished capacity due to extreme stress and flood-induced paranoia was shredded by the prosecution, who painted her as a cold, calculating sociopath motivated by greed and long-festering resentment. She was found guilty on all major charges and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Snyder received 10 years. Her assets were seized. Some neighbors still found it hard to believe, whispering that Ben must have provoked her, but they were a dwindling minority. The Sycamore Valley HOA was disbanded in disgrace. The residents formed a new, more compassionate neighborhood association. Director Elena Ramirez, hailed for her leadership and decisive action, used the experience to implement Ben's Law, mandating enhanced welfare checks for vulnerable residents during emergencies, establishing protocols for identifying malicious acts within disasters, and increasing penalties for exploiting emergencies. Her superiors, initially critical, now lauded her quick thinking, though the political fallout from arresting a prominent, if now reviled, community figure like Miller rumbled on for months, with Miller's influential family attempting to sue Elena for abuse of power, a suit that ultimately went nowhere. Elena often visited Ben Carter. He was quieter now, the dry wit edged with a new weariness, but his hands were already itching to work wood again. He showed Elena the plans for his new workshop and the spot where a new, much better security camera would be installed. He still flinched when the rain came down too hard. The floodwaters had receded, leaving a scarred but cleansed landscape. The rebuilding of Haven County, like Ben Carter's own healing, would take time, but it would be built on stronger community bonds, a renewed commitment to protecting the vulnerable, and the enduring knowledge that even in the darkest hours, courage, compassion, and justice could prevail. Karen Miller's cruelty and Snyder's weak complicity served as a permanent reminder. Ben Carter's resilience and the community that rallied around him, a beacon of hope.